It's great to be with you here this morning. I loved that time of prayer, and what I loved about it, and I'll say this, and you will probably know this, but I say this because I don't think we should take this for granted. But the sense in that prayer time, for me, was just one of thankfulness. That we can spend so much time in prayer asking all the time, yet the sense I got with the people that prayed and the people that prayed out loud, there was a sense of thankfulness. And I think if we start that way, if that's the start of our relationship with God, that we're thankful for what he is and what he's done in our lives, that's an incredible start to a relationship, if that's our starting point, rather than that starting point of, do you know what can Jesus do for me? So it was an absolute privilege to be part of that with you. As Mike says, my name's Andy, and I came across this morning with my wife Kirsty and my and Tabitha. We nearly didn't make it. We went to see some friends in Pontefract last night, and our car broke down, and we had to have the AA out. And they said, "I can get it started. When you get home, it's not going to start again until it gets repaired." So Kirsty was texting everyone that we know, can we borrow a car? We need to get to Market Rasen tomorrow. I didn't want to ring Mike and say we can't make it. I didn't want to be saying I can do it virtual. We needed to be. So we've driven across from Chesterfield this morning, just about. I've got a better car than my own, which was really exciting. I know, it's a difficult one. I'm coming to talk about a charity and I pull up in an Audi. It's not mine. So we don't have any money as a charity. Don't judge us at all. Me and my wife Kirsty, we're part of the leadership team at a church called Icon Church that are in Chesterfield, and we lead our Derby campus, which is a campus not too dissimilar size to you guys. And Icon Church is led by Paul and Jeannie Benger, who are the leaders of the Ground Level Network. And the Ground Level Network is a network that New Life is a part of. As Mike says, I met Mike at a Ground Level Leaders Network meeting. We used to work together. My story is a little bit more funny. I was head of student support. Mike was head of maths. The teachers didn't like to talk to the supports. I'm joking, but they. What's interesting about that is I don't think either of us knew at that time about our respective faiths, about our respective kind of journeys with God or relationships with God. We didn't work overly closely. We were in different departments. We met in Lincoln at some point last week, and that's why we're here. But what is key is that God was part of that. And it's really interesting to think that actually, even though you don't know it at the time, people that are in your lives and things that are happening in your lives, they overlap. And we started with the pleasantries. How you doing? What have you been up to? Then I didn't know you led a church. I didn't even know you were a Christian, which is, when I think about it, that's quite a weird thing to say to somebody who's now a church leader, vice versa. So I'm not sure what that says about me and Mike, but nothing bad at all. But then the question, what are you up to right now? Which is, for me, is a really exciting question, because what that does is gives me permission to talk. And I got to share with Mike what we were doing and the journey that we'd been on. And that led to this and me being here with you this morning. And as I said, that overlapping of stories is really inspiring and really encouraging, that we know that what we're doing is not on its own. Things overlap. God has an incredible way of overlapping and intertwining stories. That we all have our own story, but we're part of this bigger book. And today is testament to that. So I do want to talk to you about our charity this morning. But what I also want to do is talk about the journey that we've been on. And the reason for that is, what we do as a charity, it might not be interesting to you. You might not be able to relate to what we do. But what I want to do, and what I hope you will find, is that the journey that we've been on and the work that God has done through us will be an encouragement to you, and will hopefully speak to you in a very different way. Because what we see and what I want to share is how God was working through that, but how God was working through that before the charity was even an idea, before it was even a seedling in our minds. So at the same time, I want to tell you a little bit about us. I want to tell you a little bit about our journey. But then I will, because I have the permission to, talk about our charity, talk about what we do, talk about what we've done, and also talk about how you can support us to do that. Is that okay? Yeah. So when I read this, I thought, this is a bit like the book of Numbers. It's just story, and the numbers. And I thought, so I need to jazz it up a little bit. So I'll try as I go through. But I started teaching about 20 years ago. It was genuinely all I ever wanted to do. It was from being at school, from being a young person at school, from doing my GCSEs, to going to sixth form, to going to uni, to going to teacher training. That was my plan. When I got my first job, I was exactly the same. I was positioning myself constantly for that next step, for that next role. I became head of house. I became head of PE. I don't teach PE anymore, which you can tell. But my career trajectory was as linear as it comes. Is that right, Mike? Maths? Linear trajectory? That's right, isn't it? It was as stereotypical as you would expect and you would want it to be. Progression, progression, progression. I thought I was in control of what I was doing. I was loving what I was doing, and it was going in the way that I wanted it to go. I knew I was on the right path. I got my first teaching job. Mike says he got a job at Longley Park, and it was multicultural, and it surprised him. We lived in Bradford. My first teaching job was in Bradford, and I taught in Bradford at the same school for a few years, and then Kirsty was given the opportunity to move on to the graduate scheme in the NHS. She applied for that and got offered a place, which is a difficult program to get onto, but it meant the placements were in the East Midlands. We didn't know where that was. We were like, well, where are we looking for jobs? Where are we going to be? Because the East Midlands, if you know it as an area, is long and thin, and I was starting to apply for jobs as far south as Milton Keynes, as far north as Sheffield. I was like, we're stuck. But we felt confident that it would be a good opportunity for me to continue to learn and progress and develop my career, and to gain a different type of experience within education. Because as Mike says, you can work within one environment, but then teach in a very different one, and it's a very different experience. You need to learn from that, and that's part of that development. I was early enough in my career that I felt I could continue to build. It wasn't going to be a stumbling block. Before we left Bradford, I even got a role within a primary school to broaden my experience as much as possible, to give me as much opportunity when we moved to get the right job and to be well equipped to do the right thing. We settled on Chesterfield. I got a temporary role in Nottingham, and we started to establish ourselves within our new community. Chesterfield and Derbyshire are very different to Bradford. Very different. Mike alluded to that in terms of Sheffield and Market Rasen. They're very different. Schools are very different. For teachers, there's much less movement between schools. Teachers don't move because the schools are good. Teachers stay within schools. Teachers stay within areas. There's much less movement, internal movement within the schools, which for me, as somebody who wanted to progress, those opportunities are difficult to come by because there's no movement. The jobs I wanted, the jobs at certain points I just needed, they didn't exist. They weren't there. And I went from fixed-term contract to supply teaching. I'd gone from being this teacher who was so proud of what he is and what he does. I had a presence within the school I worked, to walking in schools and nobody knowing who I was. And I couldn't handle it. It was the hardest time in my career. I'm going to give you a disclaimer before. When I tell my story, my story is important to me. I get emotional when I tell my story. I have to give a splash warning to those people on the front 3 rows. So I'm going to handle myself well, but I make no apologies. I blame the Holy Spirit, and we can say that there's an anointing on this church, and that's what. I wrote a letter to every single school, and I'm not exaggerating, every single school in Derbyshire, secondary and primary, to say, that was timing, wasn't it? To say I was a teacher without a school. That's who I was. And that had been taken away from me, and I couldn't handle it. I didn't know what to do. Teaching defined me. Teaching was who I was. I wanted people to know me as a teacher, a good teacher, to know me as a school leader, and that's who I needed to be. And without that, I was lost, and I couldn't. It almost broke me. It was a tough period of suddenly we've moved from me doing this to what we're doing, and we're good with this, but to it being about Kirsty, and I couldn't handle it. My experience of being a head of year, supporting students with challenges around education, special needs, that was my passion. So I started to explore what other options were available to me. What other avenues could I start to look down to give me that way back into where I wanted to be? I got some jobs working in pupil referral units with children at risk of exclusion, children with behavioural issues, and then got a job working within community organisations. So I worked at Sheffield United Football Club and set up their education provision for children using sport and using football as an engagement tool, because we wanted to work with children that had barriers, or I wanted to work with children that had barriers. I then moved from Sheffield United to Longley, which is where I met Mike. But everything was still maybe longer term, but they were fixed term funded contracts. So the minute you start a job, people might be able to relate to this, you start a job that is fixed term and has an end point, immediately you're having to think about the next one, because you have to make sure that you've got that continuous kind of job. All I wanted to do in my mind was be back in schools, would be teaching, would be leading in schools, and get back on that trajectory that was so important to me. This went on for about 5 or 6 years. I needed to position myself differently. I was working for a community education charity, working with children, again, that had been excluded from school or were at risk of being excluded, and I had some flexibility in that role. So I started to do a master's program, which was in special and inclusive education, feeling that it would position me differently to work more specifically back in schools, but within this area. Within schools, generally, there's one person in the school that has overall responsibility for special needs. So it was a long shot, because, one job in a school, and I want it, I still know the odds are against me. But it was something I wanted to pursue. 3 months into the course, which was a distance course, I was still working for the charity, a job came up at a local school. It was 3 months in, I hadn't got that qualification yet, so it was still early. A maternity cover, fixed-term maternity cover came up. Everything about where I was said, I can't do another one. That's not what I'm preparing myself for. That isn't where I need to be. That isn't what I need to do. But something about this felt like this was my last chance to move back into mainstream education. It was a fixed term, so I knew there was a risk, but my career, my CV was awful. It was bitty. It was really chunky. There was so much on it in terms of so many different roles. It didn't look great. I applied for the job. I got it. And the job started amazingly. It was everything that I wanted. It was where I needed to be. I was working day to day with the type of children that I wanted to work with, that I was passionate about, that I felt I was skilled to do. I was in a school, and I could see things starting to lay out in front of me as I needed them to do and as I wanted them to do. I'd prayed for this for the last 6 years. So I took this job as a maternity cover. I backed myself. I think I'm good at what I do. But within 18 months, I was assistant head. I say I back myself. I believe that I'm good at what I'm doing. I'm not that good. I'm genuinely not that good. That was God. There's no consideration than that is God. There was no other rationale, the opportunities that arose at the time that they arose, the opportunity to take different roles and step up and restructures allowed me to be in that position within 18 months. There's no way it couldn't be God. But then you realize that God's got a sense of humor, and he was clearly laughing at me because I loved what I was doing. Now, for some people, this is a nightmare, but I was doing what I was doing. I was working with the police. I was working with social care. I was working with vulnerable young adults. That's where I wanted to be, but I wasn't settled. And I couldn't understand why I'd gone through this period and got this role that I thought was absolutely perfect, and I wasn't settled. It wasn't right. Something didn't feel right. I was doing what I loved. I honestly thought it was where I was called to be, but it wasn't right. And then God started to speak to me in a very different way than he'd ever spoke to me before. I was driving to school one day, and I'd stopped at some traffic lights. The journey wasn't too dissimilar to the journey that we've had coming over here this morning. It was very picturesque, big open fields either side of the road. And the fields were replaced with deserts. Just vast deserts, nothing else. And I was stood in the middle of the deserts. One of my mantras in my early days of education was around influence. And I felt that as a class teacher, I could influence the children in my class, the children in front of me. As a head of year, I could influence my year group. As an assistant head, I could influence kind of a wider section of children. As a head teacher, which is where I wanted to get to, my influence sphere started to increase. And I'd not thought of that for many years. That wasn't something that was kind of in my head all the time. But it came to me as I was seeing myself stood in the middle of the desert, and I tangibly felt God say to me, it's not enough. Your influence is not big enough. Around the same time, God placed this Bible verse in my mind. And do you know, every time you look at a reading plan, or you see those pictures on social media with the Bible verses on, or the fridge magnets on people's faces, he might as well have smacked a Bible around my head and said, pick it up and read this, because it was everywhere. And the Bible verse was Luke 5, verse 1. And I'm gonna come back to them. It's around, I'll make you fishers of men. It's a Bible verse that I'm sure many people will be familiar with. But I couldn't understand it. It didn't make any sense to me. I prayed about it, I listened, I waited, I prayed with my pastor about it, but I didn't understand it. At the same time, I was getting memories from early on in my career, which again were just back. Kind of, they weren't current. There was no reason that they were coming back to me. One of the things I didn't mention before, when I was teaching in Bradford, it was around the time of the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein's era, and we were seeing in Bradford, as in many other cities, we were seeing large numbers of children, migrants, unaccompanied minors, just turning up at school. Literally just turning up at the door, telling us that they'd been kicked off wagons hours before. They'd been told to find the nearest police station or the nearest school. As a head of year, my job at the time was about liaising with social care. It was about liaising with the police. I was listening to stories that shouldn't be coming out of children's mouths. And that defined my career. It defined my motivation. It defined my ethos around where I wanted to be and who I wanted to work with and how I wanted to teach. God was planting a seed. Back to present time, this seed germinating was really inconvenient because I was back where I wanted to be. God was disturbing me. He was interrupting this trajectory. It was like he was getting on my spreadsheets and messing it up. I thought I was walking the path he wanted me to be on. I'm going to share this Bible verse with you, and then I'm just going to talk over it a minute. Hopefully it'll come on the screen behind you as well. But it's Luke 5, for those people that are taking notes. It's Luke 5, 1 to 11. It says, one day, as Jesus was preaching on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, great crowds pressed in on him to listen to the word of God. He noticed 2 empty boats at the water's edge, for the fishermen had left them and were washing their nets. Stepping into one of the boats, Jesus asked Simon, its owner, to push it out into the water. So he sat in the boat and taught the crowds from there. When he'd finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Now go where it is deeper and let down your nets to catch some fish." "Master," Simon replied, "we worked hard all night and didn't catch a thing. But if you say so, I'll let down the nets again." This time they let the nets down. The nets were so full of fish, the nets began to tear. A shout for help brought their partners in from the other boat, and soon both boats were filled with fish and on the verge of sinking. When Simon Peter realized what had happened, he fell to his knees before Jesus and said, "O Lord, please lead me. I am such a sinful man." For he was awestruck by the number of fish that they had caught, as were the others with him. His partners James and John, the sons of Zebedee, were also amazed. Jesus replied to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you'll be fishing for people." As soon as they landed, they left everything and followed Jesus. This has become such an important Bible passage for me over the last few years. And the more I've explored it, the more I've discovered about it, the more I've resonated with it. My questions are this, though. Why now for Simon? Where was Jesus before? This wasn't the first time that those fishermen have been out to sea and not caught any fish. There were hard trips out at sea. There must have been. There were periods of tough times. There must have been. I can torture myself and ask the same question. Why, for those 6 years, where were you? Why change things now when things are as they need to be? Things are as I want them to be. In verse 2 of that passage, Simon's done. He's cleaning his nets and he's packing up and he's written the night off. "We caught nothing and I'm going home." He's conceded that it's an unsuccessful night. But along comes Jesus. But my next question is, what if Simon says no? The Bible passage said Jesus got into one of the 2 boats. Does Jesus get in the next boat? I don't know the answer to that question, but what if Simon says no? Obedience is the key word in this passage, because Simon says yes. He's got a willingness to do something that he didn't understand. Later in the Bible, we listen to Jesus say to Simon, "You are now Peter," meaning rock, "and on this rock I will build my church." Simon was known as Simon the fisherman. Simon was known for what he did. Jesus says you're going to be known for something else. If Simon says no at that point, the majority of that gospel changes. The majority of Simon's life changes. Or the majority of Simon's life stays the same. In Matthew 14, we hear that if Jesus wants to, he can walk on the water. He can part the sea. In some ways, that would have made that story a little bit better, because that's a bit more of an incredible miracle, isn't it? I think so. Jesus didn't need to go fishing. He's gone out on the boat to get away from the people, and he preached from the boat. That's what it says. He spoke to the people from the boat. He didn't need to go fishing. But maybe that's not the story that Jesus wanted to tell. Jesus says, "I want a boat. I want that boat. I want your boat. I want to use his life." Maybe that's the story that he wants to tell. And God doesn't need to use us. God chooses to use us. This is we talked about intertwining of lives, bigger picture stories. God chooses to use us because he wants to write that story. That's his story that he wants to tell, and he needs to tell. We need to trust that God's plan is bigger and better than the plan that we can hold for ourselves. This was a catch that would have sustained Simon and his family and the rest of those fishermen for a good amount of time. This was a miracle. It was an absolute miracle. Simon has no idea what's about to come next. We have the privilege of knowing the Bible, reading the Bible, and within 5 minutes I can tell you the next part of that story. Simon's in it. Simon doesn't know what's about to happen in verse 15, 16, 17. He doesn't know the miracles he's about to watch. He doesn't know the role he's about to play in the future of the church. He doesn't know any of that stuff. But they arrive back at shore, and the first thing he does is he drops his nets and he follows Jesus. His faith at that point is stronger than his fear. His faith is stronger than any consideration or any plan that he can put in place himself. At that point, I really clearly felt God say to me, this is usually the bit I get emotional for. I've already been hit, so I might be in a mess in a minute. I felt God clearly say to me, I gave you what you needed. The job, the career, the title, the net full of fish. You said that's what you wanted, and I gave it to you. You asked for it, and I gave it to you. And do you know what? It wasn't that hard. The only difference when Jesus was in the boat was that Jesus was in the boat. They didn't do anything different. They didn't drop their nets anywhere different. The only difference was Jesus was in the boat. Jesus, I felt God saying to me that, do you know what? If you want it, it's there for you. I've given it to you. It wasn't that easy. It took me 18 months. It didn't take me 18 months. I was doing things way before. In your mind, it took me 18 months. And I'll use you through it. I'll honor you through it. But do you know what? I've got something better for you. And so I dropped my nets. We dropped our nets. We prayed about it. We listened. We waited. And ultimately, I handed my notice in at my job. We had no job to go to. We sold our house. We halved our mortgage. We stripped everything back with no real idea of what we were going to do. The last time I left my job with no job to go to, I've just told you the story, and it almost broke me. And this is what we did, and this is where it gets exciting. I'm going to ask you to put slide 2 on, if that's okay. I left school in July, at the end of the term, July 2019. As in, I left my teaching job and my assistant headship in July 2019, and I started to ask the questions, where are the gaps? Where can I have an impact? Using what I know, using what I'm good at, using what I'm passionate about, where can I have an impact? Where's the need? There's 250 million children worldwide that are not in school. That's over 100 million of those are because of conflict or displacement. Hundreds of thousands of teachers are no longer in the profession because their school's been damaged, because the children have been displaced, because education systems have collapsed. In Syria, 400,000 teachers are no longer teaching. That's more teachers than we have primary school teachers in the UK. That's wiped out the education for a whole generation of young people. Things like that don't repair themselves overnight. Education systems don't repair themselves overnight. There was so much work going on in relief and humanitarian work, but no consideration for the long-term development and the restoration and the repair of those education systems. There was a lot of stopgap education, a lot of education happening that was designed for the short term, but nothing to do with education that was still equipping children for the future. We'd written the children's life chances off because of the situation that they were in right now. Did you know the average amount of time that a person spends in a refugee camp now is 10 years? Education in refugee camps originally was set up to stop the gap, to prevent that loss of learning for the fixed amount of time that children, were in those refugee camps. 10 years is nearly the same amount of time that our children would spend in their formal education lives. That's wiped out the educational chances of multiple year groups of children. If education doesn't change life chances, it's not working. Education systems across conflict-impacted areas, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, they were imploding. Government-run schools had stopped paying teachers. There was no investment in education, in training. Future generations were being denied that right to education. UNICEF says that, and the UN says that education is a human right. But we've just heard that there's 250 million children that are not getting it. Even on top of that 250 million, we know that there are millions of children that are getting it, but it's not good enough, and it's not adding any value to their lives. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know how to fix this. I can't fix this on my own. But we set out on an incredible journey, and on the 28th of February this year, we start our 4th year as a registered charity. God has opened up incredible doors for us. We've got we've got projects in 5 countries, including Lebanon, which is a cross-border project into Syria. We work in Iraq, and most recently we've just started to work in India, supporting migrants from neighboring Bangladesh and Myanmar who are moving across into the Assam region of India. Our vision, as it says up there, is for all young people to have access to high-quality, inclusive education. I said it before, if education doesn't add value to life, if it doesn't increase the life chances and the aspirations for young people, something is missing. We want everyone, children and teachers alike, to be known and to be seen within their school and community. We believe that they need to know that their lives have a value and a purpose, and that they're loved and that they have hope. These values define how we've worked over the last 3 years. They define who we are, they define what we believe and how we operate. So much so that we gave up trying to find a name for the charity, and we just called it that. We're called KnownValuedLoved because that's the values that we wanted to pursue for young people across the world. If you could move on to slide 3. All these slides, by the way, are on the flyers that one of my children will probably force on you as you walk through the door. So what do? We train teachers. We've developed our own teacher training program, which is deliverable in person, deliverable online. We offer leadership support to school leaders who are quite often isolated, untrained, and ill-equipped to do the job in the environment that they're in. We have our own resources for in-class delivery. We support teachers with development of resources which work for them. And we develop specific resources for contexts such as refugee camps and communities that are significantly impacted by refugees. In Lebanon, which is where one of our projects is, 1 in 3 people in Lebanon is a refugee. The population is 6 million. 2 million refugees in one school. Now that, if anyone knows what's happening in Lebanon, that whole country is on the brink and has been for a few years. With that influx of refugees, the school systems, the health systems, the infrastructure of the country can't cope. We're working towards opening up education development centers in India. We're working to develop the same in Kurdistan, in Iraq. And we've just been given an incredible opportunity to speak into the Taliban government, which is controversial. But they want us to develop an inclusion policy. Now, if we can develop an inclusion policy for a special needs school in Afghanistan under that regime, we're not going to fix those problems in that country, but we're going to fix the problems for those children that experience it. And that's where we need to be. Over the last year, I've visited 3 of our projects, and it's incredible to see some of the impact that's being made with our partners on the ground. Our school in Lebanon is made up of 90% Syrian refugees. We've worked with 4 school leaders. We've trained over 30 teachers within that country. We're working on a project to train teachers, Syrian teachers, to return to Syria and be equipped to open schools up again in Syria and start to rebuild communities and lives. We're working with an NGO in Lebanon as well to transfer young people from informal education settings where they can't gain any registered qualifications into government-run schools so that they can gain qualifications and so that they can continue to build their life and have a hope for the future. In Iraq, we're about to start, or when I wrote this, we were about to start. Last Wednesday, we launched our 3rd round of teacher training with a group of teachers that are working within an Iranian and Iraqi Kurd refugee camp. I visited that project last month. That is the bottom left picture down there. And we also fund an education development officer within that community to start to disseminate the training that we do with them into local schools, so that when we talk about impact and we talk about influence, that starts to disseminate outwards, because we can't do everything. Our project in Afghanistan is the school is the only registered special needs school in Afghanistan. We're working with them and the government, as I said, to ensure that all the staff have the resources to access the education and a good education for those young people. They have a very rigid exam system in a lot of these countries. Afghanistan, as an example, there are children within that orphanage that can't talk, they can't write, yet they're expected to sit the same exams as every other child in the country. That's awful, but it's incredible that, and actually, we're writing the exam access arrangement policy because the school approached the government to say, what do we do with our children? They said, we don't know. Can you write a policy? They came back to us and said, no, but can you write a policy? Which is, again, amazing to be involved in. There are so many examples that I could stand here all day and share with you, but coffee afterwards, I'd love to share more with you, because this is the beginning of our story still. God has been incredible through this journey. He continues to open doors, and I think wholeheartedly that he's gone before us. And as I continue to say yes, which sometimes is really scary, I've used an example there, but I'm aware that I wouldn't share this with my own children, so I won't share this with other children. But it is really scary. We made a decision when we set the charity up. We don't want to glamorize anything that goes on around the world. This is tough. We don't want to. You know what's going on around the world. We see it in the news. We see the pictures. We see the people that are experiencing it. You don't need to see that. Our job is to show you and to show everybody that follows us and supports us where we're making a difference, because that's where the hope is, and that's where we can continue to believe that we can continue to build that hope in. Those pictures up there, we could have replaced those pictures with the need that came before that. But actually what I want you to see is that what we're doing alongside many, many, many other charities are working to make a difference and put that hope back in. Those figures I shared earlier show us that it's a drop in the ocean. I don't stand here today and tell you that we're fixing all these problems. We're not, and we won't be. We know that we're making a difference with the children on that screen. We know that we're working. The picture right in the middle at the bottom is the special needs school in Afghanistan. And that's all we can do. We can work with where we have relationships. We can work with where we feel we can have an impact. But those figures show us that there's so much more to do. We've got new opportunities that are coming in the next year. We want people standing in front of a church today. There's a vulgar side to it. I can stand here and just say, we're a charity, we need money, please be generous. I'll say that later, I promise. But the honest side is that when God's in this, that's what's made the difference. So my ask today is far more than anything that finance will give us. Finance will help us to continue doing what we're doing. I can't shy away from that, and we never shy away from that. However, sharing our story, sharing the testimony, sharing the journey that God's been on with us is way more important, because we need prayer. We need people to walk with us. We need people to encourage us on social media. We need people to read our newsletter and get back in touch with us. We need all that because it's tough. It's not an easy thing to do. I'm going to ask you to put slide 4 on, if that's okay. If you feel you can support us, there's loads of ways you can. And there's some really exciting ways that you can do that also. Financially is one way. And I'll slightly brush over this, but I'll say this once. We do need finance to continue to do what we're doing. And that's the bottom line. We have been incredibly blessed by people supporting us, by people committing financially to us, and that's been incredible. And that's enabled us to do what we're doing. Not everybody is in a position to do that. That doesn't mean we don't make the ask. It means that we're aware that not everyone is able to do that. It might be that you can offer some time. It may be that you can commit time to fundraise for us, and that would be great. It may be that you've got a passion for education and you feel you can offer some time to help us develop resources, to offer some of the teacher training. There's loads that we need to be doing. If you shop online, which most people do these days, using easy fundraising means that if you get your home insurance using easy fundraising, which is the same as buying it with, I can't think of an insurance company, but any insurance company, we get a donation from the company. It doesn't cost you anything, but we get a donation. I think when we renewed our home insurance, we got £25 donation into the charity. Changed nothing for us, but using easy fundraising is a great way. Amazon Smile, if you shop on Amazon and you register us as your charity on Amazon Smile, I mean, you might register your church on Amazon Smile, so apologies if I'm taking money away from anyone else. But if you chose to register KnownValuedLoved on Amazon Smile, we would get a percentage of that as well. But then the really cool thing is we've done some exciting things as well. Well, everything's been exciting, but we developed our own coffee brand. So you can buy our coffee as well, and we get a percentage of the money that's generated from coffee sales as well. We've got fundraising things all the way through the year. We do online auctions. We do all sorts of things. We do a 50K walk once a year, and we call that Walking the Walk. There's loads to get involved in. The reason you would know about those things is if you follow us using social media, if you follow us using the newsletter. My ask of you today is that you actively engage in what we're doing. That doesn't mean financially. It could, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. I want people to know what we're doing, to follow what we're doing, and be encouraged by what we're doing. The second reason I want people to know that is because you might have a different story. I don't know you guys as I don't know where you're at. I don't know what your life has been. I don't know what your story is, but maybe my message has stirred something different up. Maybe my message has, or maybe God has placed something on your heart, and this message has reminded you of it. You know, God interrupts us all the time. Sometimes it's great. Sometimes it's really, really inconvenient. Maybe there's an inconvenient seed that is being planted in you or was planted in you years ago, and it's starting to germinate. Maybe something that you need to say yes to. Somebody else will say yes to it. Jesus will get in somebody else's boat. But if he does, you miss out on everything that's about to come. If that is you, it is genuinely my privilege to say that I'd love to spend some time with you afterwards. I'd love to pray with you. I'd love to encourage you, and if where possible, support you to take those steps. But what I'd love to do is just pray, and pray that however this has resonated with you, that it stirs something up. Even if it's just a reignition of what Jesus is doing here in this town, here in this church, here with your family, here with anything. Jesus told stories as he went through as we listen through the Bible, because stories resonate with us, because people's testimonies are important. They resonate with us. They tell us and encourage us and inspire us. And that's my prayer for you, that actually as I share my story, you may be encouraged by it. You may be able to support it. But maybe it's doing something else. And that's just as important, because We're about kingdom. It's not about my empire. It's not about my glory. It's not about me. It's about him. And it's about his glory, and it's about his empire, his kingdom, his heaven on earth. And we all have our own story to tell. The fact I'm stood here today suggests that our stories overlap, but everybody has their stories to tell. So I'm going to finish in prayer, if that's okay. If you join me in that, and then I'll hand back over to Mike. Lord, I thank you for this church. I thank you for everybody in this room, for the skills, the passions, the giftings that you've placed in their hearts and in their lives, Lord. I pray that you continue to speak into their lives. You continue to go before them. You continue to lead them down the paths that you want to lead them down. I pray that you disturb people. I thank you that you disturb people, Lord. I thank you that we are confident, we can be confident that you are in our stories, you are working in our stories, and you are working to bring people into each other's lives, to continue to encourage, to inspire. Lord, we just thank you for all that you are doing. Lord, we pray that we can be confident, bold followers of you. That we can say yes, that we can make our boat available. That we can be confident that when you give us what we need, we never take it for granted, and we're always willing to listen. And we're always willing to change paths for your glory. To glorify you, to bring heaven to earth, and to be your hands and your feet. Right here in Market Rasen and beyond, Lord. We thank you for this incredible time this morning together. Lord, we pray over our days, over our weeks, and over everything that we do in your glory, Lord. Amen.